The first time a cement truck rolled across my bridge, it felt like an odd oversight. The truck's belly scraped the timbers, a low, grinding protest swallowed by the muffled hush that settled over my property at dusk. The bridge had been there long before the HOA claimed jurisdiction over the lane leading to my cabin, carved from decades of stubborn maintenance and a stubborn refusal to bow to arbitrary lines on a map. It was rickety, sure. Everyone who'd seen it admitted that with a nervous laugh. But it was mine by use and history, patched by my hands, reinforced with bolts my father had insisted on. It carried walkers and wheelbarrows, the occasional deer in the car with my groceries. It was not built to ferry construction equipment the size of small buildings. The second truck felt deliberate. The third felt like a pattern. Each time, a low-level outrage settled into the tight muscles around my jaw and the quick decision-making center of my brain. Trucks came at different times of day, sometimes at dawn, sometimes in the late gray of afternoon, their drivers avoiding eye contact with the motion-activated cameras I had installed for peace of mind. The HOA's trucks, by license plate, by the stenciled logo on the doors, by the way the drivers laughed into phones after passing beneath the bridge, became unmistakable. There was a cadence to it, a weekly pilgrimage meant to flex ownership where paperwork failed. Neighbors shrugged. "It's easier that way," they'd say when pressed, folding their hands as if the problem would tidy itself. The HOA had the budget, the crew, the letterhead that made men who never read bylaws feel small. But bureaucratic arrogance has weight and consequence. Bridges, like reputations, are load-limited. Timber remembers heavy feet. I began to notice the small betrayals. A new hairline fracture at the northern beam, the faint dip in the middle plank that had not been there the summer before, a nail head pushed out like a molar on the verge of falling free. Each new crack was a notation in my private ledger of wrongs. Public confrontation was tempting and stupid. Posting angry videos, pointing a finger at a nameless Karen on the HOA board, rallying the local Facebook group. These were ceremonial medicines that produced a hot second of validation and then evaporated into performative outrage. The HOA thrived on that evaporation. Its board members existed in a loop of glossy newsletters and formal meetings where the word compromise translated into their convenience. I needed something else. Not sabotage, not violence, and not the kind of petty retaliation that would land me in a courtroom clutching a stack of regret. I needed leverage and a trap built of evidence and exposure, one that would not rely on the crack of timber, but on the crack in their armor, accountability. The plan hatched in small, cautious conversations with myself in the dark. If the HOA wanted to treat my bridge like a private runway, then the world should see the consequences of that choice. If they were going to assert control over a lane they didn't own, the cameras could evolve from deterrents to witnesses. I doubled down on documentation, not secretive instructions on how to cause damage, but meticulous records that law and reputation could not ignore. I mounted extra cameras in places that made the trucks look grand and guilty, set microphones that captured the grumble and the drivers' names when they barked orders into their radios, and timed sensors to log exact wheel crossings with date and time stamps. The technology was mundane and legal. The cruelty, if any, would come from the truth. Days turned into a ritual of vigilance. I learned the truck rhythms like a backyard farmer learns the seasonal turn. Mondays were dump days. Thursdays were the HOA's surveying runs. Each crossing fed the database that would become my quiet weapon. I mapped license plates, matched VIN numbers, and cross-referenced driver names with the HOA's payroll records that I scraped from public filings. I copied receipts from suppliers who'd delivered concrete, noting the delivery addresses that pointed not to private builds within the HOA's budget, but to private contractors paid by the HOA treasurer's shell accounts. Money trails can be as damning as a fallen beam. The HOA responded the way institutions do when they sense a threat, with petty escalation. They sent form letters, the kind that looked severe but meant little, citing vague maintenance agreements and community needs. They placed a sign at the bridge warning of temporary heavy vehicle access with a smiley face, sticker beneath the type, a ludicrous attempt at normalcy. Then they started moving more frequently, as if flooding the situation with logistics would drown scrutiny. Those moves only made the pattern clearer. The trucks were not accidental. They were a deliberate, repeated disrespect for limits. I turned the cameras into a narrative machine. Footage that had once been grainy evidence became cinematic proof when I edited the clips into sequences that told a story. The truck's approach, the creak of wood under strain, the driver's glance at the camera, the logo on the door as it rolled past my mailbox. I added timestamps, overlaid maps showing the proprietary boundaries the HOA repeatedly ignored, and annotated invoices showing payments to contractors whose trucks' license numbers matched the plates in my footage. The more I compiled, the less ambiguous the picture became. It was no longer a homeowner's paranoid montage. It was a dossier of systematic trespass. But evidence alone does not sway everyone. The HOA had friends in high places. A retired county inspector who owed his career to the HOA president's late husband, a local newspaper that preferred press releases to investigative pieces. To force their hand, I needed to make the cost of ignoring the evidence noticeable and uncomfortable. That cost would be reputational and financial, slow and inevitable. It would be the sort of thing that made donors ask questions and contractors recoil. The trap I set would not be built of spikes or burned planks. It would be built of light and law, of relentless, visible documentation that left the HOA with fewer shadows to hide in. There was an art to escalation without desperation. I filed a formal complaint with the county's Public Works Office, attaching the compiled footage and invoices. I requested a formal inspection under the county's bridge safety regulations, framing it as concern for community safety, because it was. A county inspector would not be a friend of the HOA forever. The law had teeth, and I allowed them to show them. I also began whispering evidence to the kind of freelance journalist who had a taste for community outrage and an appetite for sources. The articles that followed were calm in tone but sharp in implication. The HOA was approving heavy loads for structures never inspected, and county signs had been ignored. The HOA fired back with denials printed in vinyl on a glossy newsletter, arguing that their deliveries were routine and within their rights. Those statements made the pattern even more incriminating when juxtaposed with the timestamps and the invoices. Neighbors started to notice. Conversations at the farmer's market shifted from weather to weight limits. The local hardware store clerk commented under his breath about how odd it was to see mixers rolling down a lane meant for pickup trucks. Small fractures in the HOA's public support began to appear. A donor withdrew a promised contribution after a single phone call. A contractor requested added indemnification before he returned to a project in the HOA's name. The subtle consequences accumulated like filing dust, until the HOA could no longer pretend the matter was a trivial inconvenience. Through all of this, I kept an even face and a steady hand. I never sabotaged the trucks or the bridge. I did not place obstacles or set mechanical traps. I did not facilitate harm. The trap I set was one of truth. A net of cameras, records, inspections, and public exposure that would catch the HOA in its own momentum. There was a particular cruelty in watching those giant vehicles lumber past the exact point where the bridge's middle board had begun to sag, knowing that each crossing was a vote cast in favor of their impunity. There was also a quiet thrill in the knowledge that the next time a truck rolled across, it would roll into a dossier, a complaint, an inspector's report. The trucks had become witnesses willing to testify. And then, late one blue evening when the air smelled like cut hay and distant rain, the pattern that had felt like a slow burn began to spike into something sharper. A truck I hadn't seen before, newer, federal plates glinting in the porch light, rumbled up the lane. It hesitated at the bridge's entrance, its headlights catching the sag in the middle plank like an accusing eye. The driver tapped a small screen, looked up, and then, as if pulled by a single choreographed decision, he continued. The cameras caught everything. A slow pan to the bridge's center, the creak that began like the first whisper of an argument, and a shadow moving beneath the underframe. That shadow would be important. The footage, stitched with the county inspector's preliminary notes and a delivery manifest that did not match the project descriptions provided by the HOA, became a turning point in the dossier. What came next was not violence, and not the dramatic collapse some hoped for in the comment sections of the articles. It was the sound of a phone vibrating on a kitchen counter at 2 in the morning. The first summons papers arriving in an unmarked envelope. The HOA's treasurer requesting an emergency meeting with more people than it should have taken to organize a bake sale. The trap had been sprung by the slow, unavoidable revelation of truth. The door to the next act creaked open on the hinge of C. The morning after the first formal notice arrived, the neighborhood hummed with an almost imperceptible tension, the kind that exists just before a storm breaks. Even the birds seemed aware, their calls punctuated by the occasional metallic groan of a distant delivery truck. My cabin felt unusually still, the kind of quiet that comes when the world is holding its breath to see what happens next. The HOA had responded in predictable fashion, letters, calls, and the polite but pointed suggestion that I might consider reconsidering my stance for the sake of community harmony. But community harmony, as I knew well by now, was a euphemism for submission to their whims. The early days of escalation had been about observation. Now it was about momentum. The dossier I had assembled had shifted from a private ledger to a weaponized document, a carefully curated sequence of evidence that any impartial observer could follow. I had spent hours cross-referencing every truck crossing, invoice, and inspection note, arranging them in a visual timeline that told a story clearer than any press release could hope to convey. The HOA had expected me to be reactive, but I had positioned myself as the one controlling the narrative. Each step they had taken to intimidate me had only reinforced the strength of the trap. I noticed subtle changes in their operations almost immediately. Trucks that had previously lumbered across the bridge without hesitation now slowed at the entrance, tires crunching over gravel as if testing the timbers beneath them. Some drivers cast glances upward, almost expecting to catch a homeowner in the act of confrontation, though I was careful to remain unseen. Others muttered into radios, the words indistinguishable but tinged with tension. The pattern they had once enforced with confidence was now laced with caution, as if the very act of crossing my bridge had become a calculated risk. Neighbors began to speak differently, too. At first, it was only whispers in passing. "Did you see that truck stop again yesterday?" "I think they're finally realizing the bridge can't take it." Then the conversation expanded, spilling into casual discussions at the hardware store and over picket fences. People who had once shrugged at the HOA's heavy-handed behavior now shared fragments of concern, noting cracks in timbers and the unusual frequency of concrete trucks. The collective attention added pressure, a quiet but inexorable force pressing against the HOA's carefully constructed image of control. Meanwhile, I intensified my preparations. Sensors on the bridge were calibrated to measure not only weight but vibration, every tremor logged and time-stamped. Cameras angled to catch the license plates and logos of every vehicle feeding across the structure were synced with motion detectors, creating a near-live feed that could record and store events automatically. I even installed secondary cameras pointed at the truck's cab interiors, capturing the drivers' faces, their gestures, and the subtle signs of stress. These details mattered. In disputes like this, nuance could be more persuasive than outright damage. Then came the first meeting. The HOA's board had convened under the pretense of mediation, sending letters decorated with flowery language and vague threats about community obligations. I arrived with my documentation carefully compiled on a tablet, ready for presentation. From the outset, the meeting was theatrical. The president, a woman with a keen sense for optics, smiled broadly and leaned forward, attempting to project calm authority. But her smile faltered each time I tapped the screen to highlight an invoice, a timestamp, or a photograph of a truck straining the bridge planks. The room had been designed for intimidation. Yet the evidence was relentless and public enough that she could not mask her discomfort entirely. The discussion unfolded as a sequence of evasions, half-truths, and circular arguments. "Our trucks are necessary for community projects," she said, tapping a finger on a well-worn binder of spreadsheets. "We have obligations." I countered with maps, photos, and time logs, each click on the screen punctuating a silent narrative. They had no right to treat my bridge as a thoroughfare. The room's air felt heavier with each slide, a tension that seemed to vibrate along the floorboards, as if the bridge itself had entered the conversation. Outside the meeting room, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet anticipation. Word had spread that the board's authority was being challenged with irrefutable proof, and small acts of solidarity began to emerge. A neighbor placed reflective markers along the bridge edges, subtle but deliberate, highlighting its narrow, fragile structure. Another offered to share their own photographs of trucks crossing without oversight. The HOA's routine, once invisible and unquestioned, was now scrutinized by more than just a single determined homeowner. The weeks that followed became a delicate dance of escalation and restraint. Trucks continued to appear, but now their schedules were erratic, their drivers hesitant. Every crossing was captured, cataloged, and analyzed. The bridge's creaks and groans became part of the narrative, a slow, mechanical testimony to the absurdity of sending massive loads over a structure designed for far lighter traffic. Each day, my trap tightened, the threads of evidence and exposure weaving a pattern that was increasingly impossible to ignore. One particular afternoon, a new driver approached the bridge, young and inexperienced, unfamiliar with the territory. His hesitation was palpable. He stopped short, checked a map, and glanced nervously at the structure beneath his wheels. I recorded everything, capturing the subtle signs of uncertainty. The shifting of weight as the bridge bowed slightly under the tires, the driver's hands gripping the wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. That footage, combined with the existing timeline, would later serve as an incontrovertible record. The bridge was being used improperly, recklessly, and in clear disregard of legal limits. By the end of the second week, the trap had taken shape in more ways than one. The HOA was no longer a distant, faceless entity. It was a subject under scrutiny, a machine now exposed to light, law, and public attention. The bridge had become a fulcrum of accountability, the evidence a lever that could shift perception and authority alike. Each truck crossing, each recorded creak, each time-stamped invoice added weight to the inevitability. The HOA would face consequences. Not the sudden drama some imagined, but the slow, relentless collapse that comes when arrogance meets meticulous documentation. The first real tremor of change appeared in an email, a request for an emergency private meeting, unsigned but unmistakable in its urgency. The HOA, once confident, now reached out with cautious diplomacy, acknowledging concerns that had been ignored for months. Their usual bluster was gone, replaced by a careful attempt to negotiate, to reassert control in ways that minimized public exposure. But the trap had already been set. The net was already cast. Every interaction, every communication would now be part of the public record. Each misstep a demonstration of pattern and intent. It was in this quiet shift, this subtle collapse of authority, that the true power of patience and documentation became clear. The bridge remained intact, a silent witness to the persistence of one determined homeowner. And the HOA began to realize that no amount of letters, meetings, or superficial charm could undo the consequences of repeated overreach. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the wooden planks, I walked to the center of the bridge. The sensors beneath my feet recording every subtle movement, the cameras capturing the final light of day. The first signs of real change were visible. The board's emails grew more conciliatory, their deliveries fewer and more hesitant, their confidence slipping like water through fingers. The trap was no longer theoretical. It was active, immediate, and undeniable, and yet this was only the beginning. The HOA had begun to feel the pressure, but the next stage would demand ingenuity and patience, a combination of strategy, timing, and exposure that would ensure they could never return to the bridge as if nothing had happened. The next chapter would show how escalation, when wielded wisely, can turn intimidation into vulnerability, and how a single homeowner's careful planning could rewrite the rules for an entire community. The third chapter began with an ordinary Monday that tasted anything but ordinary, a stretch of gray sky, a hint of rain in the air, and an inbox that hummed like a beehive. The HOA's response to the mounting evidence had taken predictable forms: denials, evasions, and increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative. Where it became interesting was the manner of their desperation. Institutions that believe themselves invulnerable make the kind of mistakes born of arrogance and fatigue. They rely on old tricks, on the hope that repetition blunts scrutiny. They assumed the dossier was a nuisance they could outshout with glossy mailers and sympathetic handshakes. They miscalculated how stubborn the truth can be when it's been archived, time-stamped, and distributed. The first misstep was procedural and almost laughable in its incompetence. In an effort to preempt the county inspector's looming report, the HOA's president attempted to retroactively produce a permit file that would justify some of the heavier deliveries. The file was clumsy, documents photocopied at different scales, dates inconsistent, and signatures that bore the unmistakable wobble of someone trying too hard. It was not so much a forgery as it was a confession on paper. When I compared the alleged permits to the county's official records, the differences leapt out like splinters. A forged permit mattered less than the fact that they had tried to create one at all. The attempt revealed a willingness to circumvent rules rather than to follow them. The second mistake was social and more damaging. The HOA's internal communications, shared in what they thought were private channels, began to leak. Someone in the organization, a contractor, an admin assistant, perhaps a junior board member tired of the dishonesty, forwarded emails and text messages to a freelance journalist who had been asking questions. The messages were petty and revealing. Jokes about force testing the bridge, references to pushing boundaries with delivery schedules, and offhand comments that suggested an awareness of the structure's fragility. The tone was less conspiratorial than casual, the kind of language that indicates institutional hubris. When people speak of harm as if it were an experiment, they reveal how easily they treat real-world consequences like abstract data points. Those leaks made the county inspector's eventual report inevitable and brutal. The inspector, a methodical person with a fondness for checklists and precise language, arrived one morning and moved through the bridge with the dispassionate thoroughness of someone cataloging a crime scene. He measured, recorded, and photographed. His preliminary notes, when filed, read like a condemnation. The bridge was structurally deficient for loads above light vehicles. Several support beams showed stress fractures consistent with repeated overloading, and maintenance records were inconsistent at best. The report used clinical neutral words, but these words carried weight in the world of finance and liability. When insurers and contractors read them, they felt the pressure in their balance sheets. Public perception shifted faster than anyone expected. A local radio host with a taste for civic scandal ran an hour-long piece dissecting the inspector's findings and juxtaposing them with the leaked messages. Calls poured into the HOA's office, some angry, some bewildered, many asking how such oversight could have been allowed. Donors called to postpone contributions until the matter was resolved. A contractor who had previously been eager to bid on HOA projects called to withdraw his estimate, citing unacceptable risk. The HOA's polished veneer fractured into visible cracks that matched the ones in the bridge. Faced with tangible consequences, the HOA made a third and most crucial error. They panicked publicly. Rather than engaging with the inspector's recommendations and negotiating a transparent remediation plan, the board released a combative statement accusing malicious actors of undermining community cohesion. The language was performative, designed to rally supporters, but it read as defensive and evasive in equal measure. That defensiveness alienated reasonable residents who wanted a straightforward path to safety and resolution. Momentum that had once moved subtly now had the force of public opinion behind it, and the HOA found itself suddenly on the defensive in multiple forums: legal, financial, and reputational. I stayed out of the headlines, a quiet presence behind the dossier, but I watched the mechanics of their panic with interest. Panic is a brittle state. It fractures easily under pressure. The HOA's legal counsel, sensing vulnerability, proposed a settlement that looked generous on the surface but contained sweeping indemnities and a demand that the county drop any potential enforcement actions. It was a classic overreach masked as conciliation. Their offer implied that the best way to move forward was to silence scrutiny and to transfer risk entirely onto any dissenting homeowner who might challenge them again. The proposal was unacceptable and, crucially, evidence that the HOA still believed it could buy its way out of accountability. Meanwhile, a whistleblower in the contractor chain surfaced, with a copy of an email thread showing a series of instructions that explicitly directed drivers to use my bridge as the primary access point for deliveries to several seemingly unrelated projects. The whistleblower's voice, calm, tired, and precise, explained that the orders came with the implicit backing of a board member who wanted convenience over compliance. That single file connected dots in a way that invoices and timestamps had only hinted at. It named names and added motive. The whistleblower did not want to be a hero. They wanted safety and a return to reasonable practices. Their moral discomfort became a public arrow that pierced the HOA's assisted opacity. Legal motion followed with the inevitability of weather. The county threatened fines and required immediate load restrictions until the bridge could be reinforced or avoided entirely. The insurer opened a claims inquiry that put the HOA's risk management in the spotlight. A small class action conversation bubbled among a handful of neighbors who had seen the bridge used recklessly. Their interest was pragmatic, to avoid being the defendant in a future lawsuit if the bridge failed. Even the local paper, which had been slow to bite in the early days, published an editorial asking for transparency and for the HOA to shoulder the costs of corrective action rather than foisting them onto homeowners. Temptation to celebrate the apparent victory flickered across my mind, but I remained cautious. Systems are resilient in ways humans underestimate. They adapt and find new vectors to assert control. I tightened the documentation, cross-checked the whistleblower's files, and prepared for predictable counterattacks, legal threats, attempts to discredit witnesses, and perhaps efforts to paint me as a provocateur. The HOA's next moves would be telling. Would they choose to repair, to accept oversight, and to collaborate on a safe path forward? Or would they double down, using their remaining influence to drag this into costly, protracted legal warfare, hoping fatigue would win? The answer started to arrive in the form of subpoenas and the first hint of internal revolt. A faction within the HOA, younger members and those tied to local businesses who had seen their reputations tarnished through association, started to whisper about leadership changes. The treasurer, whose records had been the most egregious in terms of opacity, found himself facing pointed questions at a hastily organized community forum. People who had once deferred to his authority now demanded clearer accounting. He stumbled under scrutiny, and the public's patience thinned. By the time the rain returned in earnest, drumming on the cabin roof like a percussionist emphasizing a crucial beat, the HOA was a different organism. It still existed, of course, with its newsletters and banquets and bylaws, but its aura of unassailable power had been pierced. The bridge was still standing. The repairs had not yet begun, but forces more durable than fury were at work: law, documentation, dwindling allyship, and the slow drip of financial consequence. The trap had closed further, not with a dramatic snap, but with the grinding of legal gears that promised prolonged accountability. The final scene of this chapter was less a climax than a pivot. In a scanned board memo that leaked to my inbox late at night, the president proposed an emergency diversionary measure: reroute all heavy deliveries through the secondary access road, a path that wound farther and was owned in part by a developer with whom the HOA had a complicated arrangement. The memo read like an attempt at damage control, but it was also an admission of failure, a small administrative surrender that acknowledged the bridge could not continue as before. The memo's implications, however, were complex. Rerouting could lower immediate risk, but it would also shift the burden and possibly bring new conflicts. The HOA's hands were forced, and with their options narrowed, their next move would be unpredictable. As the chapter closed, the scene held a sense of precarious momentum. Not the clean resolution some imaginations craved, but a realignment of power and possibility. The trap had not yet yielded the full measure of consequence, but it had forced change where change had been denied. What remained was the slow work of ensuring that the repairs were genuine, that accountability stuck, and that the HOA could not simply resurface with the same habits under a new name. The next chapter, then, would be about repair, resistance, and the complexities of converting a small victory into lasting reform. The morning light spilled over the cabin like a reluctant witness, illuminating the bridge in muted gold. The planks bore the faint scars of the trucks that had crossed in defiance of their limits, each groove and splinter a record of stubborn insistence. The HOA, chastened by public scrutiny, legal pressure, and the unflinching evidence I had compiled, finally moved toward what they hoped would appear as corrective action. But correction, in this kind of long-running conflict, is never simple. Institutions do not admit error gracefully. They negotiate, obfuscate, and sometimes, if cornered enough, attempt to co-opt the narrative for themselves. My task had shifted: oversight, verification, and the careful application of continued pressure. The first tangible sign of change came as a notice pinned to the community bulletin. The bridge was now subject to formal weight restrictions, accompanied by a vague promise of inspection and reinforcement. The HOA's wording tried to frame this as proactive leadership, but the underlying message was unavoidable. They had been caught and constrained. Contractors, who once had been flippant about the risks of heavy vehicles, now inquired repeatedly about the bridge's safe load limit before scheduling deliveries. The daily rhythm of the trucks altered almost immediately. Their hesitation was tangible. Drivers slowed, double-checked manifests, and sometimes refused the route entirely. The bridge's timbers, once groaning under predictable abuse, now felt the relief of reduced strain. My cameras recorded everything: every subtle shift in pattern, each hesitant wheel crossing, and the rare moments when a delivery took an unapproved path and triggered a sensor. I compiled these records in real time, cross-referencing them with invoices and internal communications that had begun trickling through with an almost inevitable delay. By now, the HOA's leadership was not merely reacting to my presence. They were responding to a legal and public narrative that had taken on its own momentum. One misstep, one ignored regulation, could cascade into liability far beyond the original misadventure with the bridge. The internal dynamics of the HOA began to fracture visibly. A faction of board members, younger and less invested in maintaining appearances, began advocating for genuine repairs, proper permits, and compliance with county regulations. Their voices, once muted by tradition and hierarchy, now carried weight because the alternative, continued exposure and potential financial fallout, had become clear. Meanwhile, more conservative board members, stubborn in their habitual entitlement, resisted, issuing memos and internal statements insisting that the problem had been overblown. These documents, of course, only fed the narrative I had meticulously curated, highlighting patterns of internal conflict and demonstrating that oversight, rather than negligence, had been necessary to prevent further escalation. The reinforcements arrived slowly, each movement documented by my cameras and sensors. Steel beams were lowered carefully into place, planks replaced, and weight limits posted. Contractors had to sign acknowledgement forms, and county inspectors were present to verify compliance. The HOA tried to control the optics, framing each move as their initiative. Yet, the documentation told a more precise story. These actions were reactive, compelled by a homeowner's vigilance and public accountability rather than voluntary good faith. The difference may have seemed subtle, but in the court of public perception and legal scrutiny, it was decisive. Neighbors, who had once watched from the sidelines, became increasingly involved. Some volunteered to monitor deliveries, noting truck times and vehicle numbers. Others began keeping photographic records of their own. The community's collective oversight created a multiplier effect. The HOA now faced accountability not only from the legal system, but also from an informed and organized populace. For the first time, it was clear that the bridge was no longer just a physical structure. It was a symbol of transparency, oversight, and the potential for ordinary homeowners to assert influence over institutional overreach. The HOA, in its attempts to regain control, made several miscalculations during this period. They underestimated the value of timing and attention, sending contractors and trucks in smaller batches that looked innocuous but actually increased scrutiny. Every move, seemingly minor, added layers to the documentation and further demonstrated their unwillingness to adjust behavior without compulsion. The repeated exposure of their operational weaknesses reinforced the public narrative. The bridge was safe now only because of vigilance, not trust. Meanwhile, I began preparing for the final stage of accountability. The aim was not vengeance but systemic change, ensuring that any future attempts to bypass regulations would face the same level of scrutiny and consequence. I worked with local legal counsel to draft a framework for monitoring, creating a structure that could persist beyond the immediate crisis. Contracts, permits, and inspection reports were cataloged in a manner that allowed for rapid review if any part of the HOA attempted to revert to old habits. The bridge had become both a test case and a precedent, a physical and procedural proof of principle. By midweek, the atmosphere around the bridge had changed entirely. Drivers who had once scoffed at weight limits now treated them as law, slowing to a cautious crawl. The HOA's internal communications, leaked or otherwise observed, began to reflect genuine concern for compliance rather than attempts to circumvent it. There was no celebration, no public announcement, just a steady, visible pattern of reform, enforced by observation, documentation, and pressure. The community felt safer. The bridge, resilient yet now clearly reinforced, embodied that shift. But the narrative was not yet complete. The HOA still retained influence and connections, and their pride had been wounded. I remained vigilant, tracking subtle shifts, reviewing communications, and maintaining the network of cameras and sensors. The final act would demand careful timing, a methodical application of pressure that ensured the HOA could not revert to arrogance once public attention waned. The chapter closed on a quiet evening, with rain slicking the wooden planks and reflecting the amber glow of nearby streetlights. I stood at the center of the bridge beneath me solid and reinforced, the sensors quietly recording every creak and vibration. In the surrounding quiet, I could feel the momentum of change. Institutional awareness forced into humility, a community emboldened by scrutiny, and a bridge that had survived more than just weight. It had survived arrogance, inertia, and the assumption that power could ignore responsibility. The stage was set for the final chapter, the ultimate consolidation of accountability, the resolution of the HOA's pattern of overreach, and the full reckoning that would transform both the bridge and the community forever. The morning arrived quiet but charged, the kind of stillness that precedes finality. The bridge, now reinforced and clearly marked with weight limits, stood as a sentinel over the lane it had long carried. Months of preparation, documentation, and careful observation had led to this point. The HOA, stripped of their habitual certainty and public bluster, moved cautiously, knowing that every action could be scrutinized, recorded, and disseminated. For the first time, they were not the arbiters of power. They were participants in a system of accountability they had once assumed they controlled. The initial legal proceedings were swift and undeniable. The county's enforcement division, armed with inspection reports, photographic evidence, timestamps, and invoices meticulously compiled over weeks, issued citations and required immediate remediation measures. Each citation carried weight. Fines calculated per violation, deadlines for structural repairs, and obligations for ongoing monitoring. The HOA's leadership scrambled to comply, their usual confident statements replaced by cautious, internally reviewed correspondence. Their attorneys debated strategy in hushed tones, fully aware that missteps would be amplified by the wealth of evidence already in public view. Public attention reached its peak during this period. Local media outlets, previously casual observers, now covered every delivery, repair, and inspection, framing the bridge as the focal point of a larger narrative about civic responsibility, homeowner rights, and the perils of institutional arrogance. Community forums, once dominated by HOA influence, erupted with discussion, tips, and evidence from residents who had taken photos, kept logs, or simply witnessed trucks ignoring limits. The combined force of public pressure, legal accountability, and neighborhood vigilance created an environment in which the HOA's every move was constrained. The board's internal dynamics fractured irreparably. Members previously silent or complicit voiced frustrations about leadership decisions that had led to public scrutiny and financial liability. Some resigned quietly, citing personal stress and reputational concerns, while others sought to distance themselves from prior communications and directives. The treasurer, whose records had been particularly damaging, faced the threat of formal investigation for mismanagement of funds and failure to comply with county regulations. The president attempted to assert authority through procedural motions and calls for emergency meetings, but these efforts were largely symbolic. The HOA had lost control of the narrative and, more importantly, lost the trust necessary to wield influence effectively. Repairs and reinforcement continued under strict oversight. Engineers verified the bridge's structural integrity, contractors adhered to formal load schedules, and inspections were documented in a manner designed to prevent any recurrence of unauthorized crossings. Every heavy vehicle now approached with caution, every delivery carefully logged, and every deviation noted. The bridge, once a silent victim of arrogance and overreach, had become a monument to accountability and vigilance. The transformation was visible, tangible, and lasting. The climax of the homeowner's strategy came with the final consolidation of the trap. Evidence collected over months, videos, timestamps, invoices, leaked internal communications, and whistleblower testimony was presented in a single, comprehensive report to both county authorities and local media. The dossier left little room for misinterpretation. The HOA had repeatedly ignored safety limits, attempted to manipulate documentation, and treated private property as an extension of institutional convenience. Public records, reinforced by the meticulous compilation of private observation, ensured that the consequences would endure. The result was both immediate and long-term. Fines were levied, policies were amended, and oversight procedures were instituted to prevent future abuse. The HOA's public credibility suffered an indelible blow, and its internal leadership faced both scrutiny and turnover. Community members, once passive, emerged emboldened by the efficacy of careful observation and evidence-based action. The bridge itself, now fully reinforced, carried the physical and symbolic weight of the conflict, a testament to the power of patience, diligence, and strategic pressure in the face of institutional arrogance. Through it all, the homeowner remained a steady, quiet force. There were no confrontations, no acts of sabotage, no dramatic collapses. The outcome was the product of careful planning, relentless documentation, and the strategic application of pressure over time. The HOA had acted recklessly, and the consequences had been unavoidable, a natural outcome of systems designed to enforce accountability in the presence of evidence and public oversight. As the final evening settled over the property, the bridge gleamed under the fading light, the timbers solid and secure, the sensors quietly humming their watch. There was a sense of closure, of balance restored. The neighborhood, once wary and passive, now moved with a shared awareness of limits, responsibilities, and the importance of vigilance. The HOA had learned painfully that power untempered by accountability is brittle. Mistakes once documented become lessons for all who witness them. In the end, the homeowner's patience, diligence, and strategic foresight had created a lasting legacy, not only a repaired and reinforced bridge, but also a framework for accountability that would prevent future overreach. The narrative, once dominated by intimidation and reckless authority, had shifted entirely. The bridge, standing firm in the quiet dusk, was no longer just wood and steel. It was evidence, testimony, and a monument to the slow but inevitable triumph of persistence and careful strategy over unchecked power. The chapter closed on the stillness of the evening, a quiet victory not celebrated with fanfare but marked by enduring consequence. The HOA, chastened and constrained, would remember the lessons imposed by a single homeowner's unwavering commitment, and for the neighborhood the bridge remained both passage and proof that diligence, patience, and methodical preparation could reshape the rules of engagement forever.